Welcome to Psychology and Other 2025. My name is Sheldon George. I'm a professor of Africana Studies at UMass Boston, and it's my pleasure to open the conference tonight and to introduce you to our keynote, Dr. Hortense Spillers. So by way of beginning, I'd just like to say a few things about the conference and about Dr. Spillers. Psychology and Other has been around since 2011. In that time, we featured such luminaries as Homi Bhabha, George Yancey, Judith Butler. With Dr. Spillers here today, I can say we're only getting better. So the aim of the conference is to bring together people from a range of fields: philosophy, psychology, theology, and its purpose is to help shape a new, more enriched language for human suffering. A language that can catalyze responses that are both empathetic and meaningful. Dr. Spillers' work perfectly aligns with this purpose. Her talk tonight is framed by Frantz Fanon's provocative assertion that the Oedipus complex has not emerged in the Antilles. Fanon called for a remaking of both psychoanalysis and the racist world itself. He proclaimed the need for a new man, a man freed of the barbaric impulses that generated the brutalities of slavery and colonialism. Dr. Spillers' work has been integral to the field of psychoanalytic studies because it produces just such a remaking of both psychoanalysis and the social field. But where Fanon proclaimed that he knows nothing about what the Black woman wants, Dr. Spillers has made this woman a primary focus of her work. Dr. Spillers' writings have helped lay the foundation for the fields of Black studies and women's studies. In 1984, she challenged feminists to, quote, initiate a corrected and revised view of women of color on the frontier of symbolic action. She announced what she described as a putting afoot of a new woman, not a new man, a new woman who is no longer buried in what she called the interstices of a bizarre axiological ground. Her writings would not only shape Black studies and women's studies, but they would help give birth to a new field of inquiry, one of the fastest developing investigations of psychoanalytic theory and race, called Afro-pessimism. These fields grew out of Dr. Spillers' pioneering work on psychoanalysis as a branch of study that required revision for what she called the socionome, the subject of a social reality that remained absent from the extended discourses of psychoanalysis. It's this socionome that this conference also seeks to locate. Dr. Spillers' work investigates the socionome through a strategy that she calls interior intersubjective. This interior intersubjectivity is a self-reflectiveness that's capable of sustaining the gaze of the erstwhile outsider. Decades before this conference, Dr. Spillers rooted subjectivity in a psychology that recognized the other. What she called for, and what we seek to establish at this conference is, in Dr. Spillers' own words, a homeland that is as sufficient to the needs of strangers as of kin. So I want to welcome Dr. Spillers and her respondents. They are Dr. Derek Hook, who is a practitioner of psychoanalysis and a professor of psychology at Duquesne University, and Dr. Aliyah Abdur-Rahman, who is professor of American Studies and English at Brown University. Now, without further ado, I give you Dr. Hortense Spillers.
That was fast. I thought I had another minute or two. That was lovely too. The introductions are always the best part of these occasions. I wish that were the keynote itself. It's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming out today in this beautiful weather, in a city that doesn't always have beautiful weather. I lived here about 10 years and I remember that, so I really appreciate your coming. This might be the second time I have been on this really exquisite campus. So it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Professor George for extending this invitation to me to come to this conference, although I hope he extends the invitation again.
Anytime.
Okay, this
Open invitation.
open invitation. This is what happened. The paper that I wanted to write, I didn't really get a chance to write that. Well, it's true, because it's something of a medical crisis. And so what I'm going to give you today, more than a paper, you might think of me as a member of this panel of speakers. What I'm going to give you today is a set of remarks about what I hope to provide some final and more definitive form on when I have had the opportunity to do the kind of work that I would really like to do on this question, because I think it's an important one. So you might see me again if I live to do that work. I call this paper Writing with Oedipus. I think there's more to the title, but I think it's important just to say that, right? That part of it. You will recall that Frantz Fanon, in his first published text, I believe, denies the efficacy of the Oedipus complex in any determination of social and historical destiny concerning the Negro of the Antilles, a fictional invention that Fanon creates in the interest of advancing a plausible reading of the mental theater that unfolds in the life of the subject of the African diaspora. This figure takes his place alongside a repertoire of characters who inhabit our 20th century and 21st century imagination about the complicated personality who emerges on the other side of slavery and colonization. In a very real sense, we are primed for an encounter, if not exactly with ourselves, then a very close analogy. We know this Negro and his ambitions to go somewhere and to be somebody. Though he is a young male, we are called upon to imagine that a similar configuration of dreams and desire compel his sister, although I'm not so sure that the question has even been put. In any case, the Negro of the Antilles might be thought of as an imaginative resource that yields theoretical riches to Fanon in his psychoanalytic project. And what is its aim and purpose? Disalienation lends its name to the conceptual calling of Fanon's teachers and intellectual progenitors, Aimé Césaire, chief among them, and it explains the activity of undoing the massive psychic danger and damage of colonization and enslavement. In the opening pages of Black Skin, White Masks, starring, so to speak, the Negro of the Antilles, the reader is told that what will eventuate in a putting afoot a new man entails, quote, an immediate recognition of social and economic realities. If there is an inferiority complex, it is the outcome, he argues, of a double process, primarily economic, subsequently the internalization of this inferiority. If we can think of the economic as a number with an unrelenting material register, then its doubleness will involve an invisibility of effect. Something decisive and dynamic happens, but how it does so remains hidden. And what Fanon proposes to expose are the processes that interact and intercept in a three-way dialectic that choreographs the phylogenetic, the ontogenetic, and the sociogenetic contents against a spatio-temporal field. The phylogenetic would name what belongs to us as a result of our human status. The ontogenetic would account for individual variation in a generalized human picture. And the sociogenetic content, a Fanonian theoretical innovation, makes its appearance as a kind of public relations gambit. Who do others say that the Negro of the Antilles is? Woven out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories, the sociogenetic veers toward myth if we think of the latter in the Barthesian sense, or in Barthesian terms, as a discourse ordained by history, whose grammars we inherit whether we like it or not. It seems to me that the battle implied by the disparity between skin and mass is played out on the ground of the sociogenetic. Fanon writes, I thought that what I had in hand was to construct a physiological self. And I think we might regard what he thought he was doing, or what he is suggesting is normal for one to do, is to approach the ontological threshold, to balance space, to localize sensations, but rather what he gets instead is the interpolated Negro. Look, Mom, a Negro. I was called upon, he says, for more. So what is this more that Fanon is designating? What is he pointing to? In any event, the circumstance that he is laying out with what I would consider fictional consistency, I think more and more that it's a book that should be taught alongside Invisible Man, alongside Du Bois, and other fiction, that he's laying out what kind of fictional consistency does not have the occasion to become an element of the unconscious, he argues, so that Fanon removes from the picture one of the cornerstones of psychoanalytic thinking, and that is to say the Oedipus complex. As he puts it, the Negro of the Antilles is a phobogenic object, a stimulus to anxiety. And even though one is certain that the conclusions he is about to draw should be read sideways or regarded as a kind of comic flippancy, he nevertheless claims that Negro phobogenesis cannot be explicated via psychoanalysis. And as a result, quote, the Oedipus complex is far from coming into being among Negroes. In the French Antilles, he contends, it can be shown that in 97% of Black French Antillean families, not one Oedipal neurosis can be produced. I have always read this passage with considerable alarm, primarily because I wish to mark the breaks and gaps between traditional psychoanalytic thinking and the variety of revisionary and corrective gestures that respond to its premises. And I think of Fanon as a kind of guide in that work. But if he is telling us that not one Oedipal neurosis can be found in the Antilles, well, that was the 40s and 50s. Maybe now you might find one, right? But above all, I'm interested in naming and elaborating an intramural dimension of African diasporic existence and depending on Fanon to help me do that. Bridging a hiatus imposed by historical pressures between race on the one hand and psychoanalytic theory and practice on the other, intramurality would constitute a systematic response to the historical conditions that engendered the diaspora in the first place. The attention to circumstance has been compelled generally away from natal community toward an aggressor who yields biopower. But relatedly, I've been attempting to solve a problem more precisely. What would an efficacious response to the diasporic problematic look like? The way that I have framed the question in my own mind is, what is the quiddity or idness of experience on the other side of middle passage? One of the consequences of this massive transfer of cultural and social power might be described as Oedipal deferral or Oedipus deferred. And the hunch that I'm trying to bear out is that this deferral throws forth substantial implications. It is, in short, to my mind, the other shoe to drop that proffers a missing piece of the conundrum of the diaspora itself. I think of the Oedipal complex as the transfer of authority from one generation to the next. Sexual differentiation is symbolically linked to the discovery of positionality, to the discovery of authority. So I think of authorial transfer as inherently vertical. This, of course, is the configuration of ancestry as opposed to kinship. We think of it as generational succession. And what crosses the verticality of authority is the horizontality of kinship, siblings in relationship, or human beings shoulder to shoulder. But what middle passage darkens, to my mind, is the protocol of authority. I do not see an authority, or the authority is not me, nor can be. So what does it portend for the intramural? I've wondered if one way we can talk about what I'm talking about is to give it a rather more colloquial swagger, right? We talk about black on black crime. Well, what does that mean? And that's where the notion of the horizontal of kinship comes in, because what was lost in Middle Passage was the authority that the father and the mother convey to the children, right? That was simply not there, and I no longer believe that the configurations of colonization and enslavement offer an efficacious substitute for that missing item. Oedipus African by Marie-Cécile and Edmond Ortiz was written in 1984 on the basis of work that they conducted. These are, as you know, French psychoanalysts who worked in the field of Senegal for 4 years, between 1962 and 1966. And they wrote up their researches in African Oedipus, or Oedipus African. So as opposed to Fanon, the Ortizes project a very different idea about Oedipus and the complex. And I want to look just a moment at what this couple writes up about some of the major questions that their 20 years in the field engender. So I just want to read a couple of passages from the introduction of Oedipus African. Okay. Now you might want to think of this work also in connection with the work by Ibrahim Sow, The Anthropological Structures of Madness in Black Africa. And I wondered if they were any influence on Sow, who was also a Senegalese practitioner. What this book proposes is to give an account of clinical experience in which the patient and the clinician, the consultant and the consulted, are led to put into question a certain number of schemes of their respective traditions. Now, I'm reading this in translation from the French. You know, I hope one day I don't find out, oh boy, did I get that wrong. But so, okay. So, the patient, because he or she has recourse to, quote, European medicine, because he has not been satisfied nor hopeful of being satisfied by traditional treatment. The clinician, because he is obligated to reconsider everything that links his practice to a certain social context. Okay. Now they go on to claim, at the beginning of our sojourn in Senegal, and before undertaking clinical work, we had the tendency to think, like everybody else, that the Oedipus complex probably does not exist in Africa. We did not have a precise idea about this. We were even under the influence of courses that had been offered by Maurice Merleau-Ponty on the American Culturalist School, and so on. So the clinical observations that we made in the car showed us that the question of the father is presented in the African milieu with the same constancy as in Europe, and that among the Serre, matrilineal Serre, as well as among the patrilineal Wolofs. The constant reference to the father was a decisive test, an undeniable fact. And what I wanted to have the opportunity to do was reread that entire text, because I think it can be very instructive. So, I am writing with Oedipus on this because I want to bring the African father back into view. Now, this is the father who tends to be alighted with the scenery, primarily because the practices of slavery and its laws remove the father from sight by making the child follow the mother's conditions. I am no longer convinced, as I said before, that slavery's white fathers or the entire planter class are a substitute for the African father simply because the former are highly visible. I'm curious to know what lights up beyond the obvious. And in that regard, writing with Oedipus retrieves certain prior questions initiated by both Freudian thought and Africanity as it attempts to invade, eventually, hereditary premises and habitual uses and expectations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spillers. So I think what we'll do now is try to think alongside of Dr. Spillers. We've generated a few questions sort of based on our expectations of the presentation. And the aim is for everyone to pose perhaps 2 questions. Maybe we'll go down the line, or if we can get a conversation going, we'll just hop in as opportunity allows. I'd like to save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So maybe I'll start. So lots of rich ideas to engage here. Let's see if I can structure some of this. One of the things that I've noticed, Dr. Spillers, in your work, given that this is a psychoanalytic conference, it's perhaps important to note this. You have perhaps a love-hate relationship, I don't know if you would describe it in that way, with psychoanalysis. You say at one point in one of your essays that you believe, I think you said 50% of what Freud says, and and Lacan has no language for the social, but yet still you keep coming back to psychoanalysis. And so I'm interested in what it is that draws you back to psychoanalysis. And I can continue, but perhaps you can start there, and I'll follow up.
What I have always found profoundly seductive about Freud is his philosophical bent, his storytelling, his writing. I don't know what to think about the science But it's, you know, it's the art of Freud. And when I think of our time, I think of three major thinkers that have had a lot to do with shaping the way we think about the world, the way we attempt to be in the world. And that's Darwin, Marx, and Freud. The discovery of the neurosis, I think, is a major contribution. And so that gives us the license to go somewhere else in our thinking about what it means to be human. And so I find myself returning to him as a kind of touchstone, right? Yeah.
Okay, so if I can follow up then, so you described Freud as artistic, but as drawn, as somehow revealing something important about the psyche, right? You also talked about Fanon as somewhat of an artist, as someone who generates a myth, a fiction about the Antillean Negro. It seems to me like one of the things that you focused on in your work with Fanon is the sense that Fanon is not in touch with the people, with the social reality. He has no clear sense of an agency, a disalienation that can come from the people. And Derek and I are just back from the Fanon at 100 conference in Martinique. And that view of Fanon is interesting because one of the things I learned there while visiting slave museums in Martinique is that Martinique is one of the only places where the slaves revolted and brought about the end of slavery. So it's interesting that Fanon doesn't find agency there. But there's another artist that you mentioned, Ralph Ellison. I'm interested in your notion of the intramural, which I think seems to combine a focus on the communal and the here and now, but also a sort of broader historical and social awareness of context that perhaps isn't as present in Fanon. And Ralph Ellison has that very famous essay, The World in the Jug, in which he says that people think of African Americans as being trapped in a jug, but if they're trapped in a jug, the jug is transparent and they see what's going on out there. So my question to you is, and he also says that because he sees what's going on out there, he wishes to recognize Richard Wright as a forefather, but he claims Ernest Hemingway as an ancestor. So my question to you is, what are the borders of this intramural in your conception of it? And how do you think about Blacks who claim non-Blacks as ancestors? How do we think of ancestry when it is not within the community? And how does that align with this notion of the intramural? A long question.
As you were talking about the world and the jug, I was thinking of another Ellison essay, Little Man at Cheehaw Station. And in that particular work, African American personality has access to all of the world, right? So that in effect, he brings the world to him and lives in the world, not as somebody who's paying rent, but somebody who has, in effect, his own place, right? And so, yes, exactly, a homeland within himself. And so I think it is that wealth of resource that might constitute a boundary that doesn't really have a boundary, that is boundless, right? And so I think that's the way I want to see the intramural. I want to break out of the straitjacket of something that is bound by a particular idea about race, but one that has access to whatever it needs access to. And so for me, the intramural would make that possible by acknowledging that I have relations with others like myself, right? That my relation to those persons, first of all, persons, is not a fantasy, and it is as important as anything else, as any other relation, right? And so that's why I think it has to be named, right, as a dimension of existence, because we usually don't. I mean, we usually talk about, well, I mean, like anti-black hatred, for example. We usually name that particular aggression, but I'm trying to name that other one that's talked about less, right? Yeah, because we make certain assumptions about that one. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll pass the mic on to Aaliyah or Derek. Aaliyah?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Spillers. Thank you. So I wanted to, I was thinking about it just as you were reading, and thinking about the figure of the father, but also the kind of paternal function of the enslaved African American man. I wanted to, I was thinking that even as the enslaved progeny follows the condition of the mother and seems to disappear from a kind of human relation into the economic imperatives of enslavement, that the paternal function is retained in some ways. And my suspicion of this, and why I was thinking about this, possibly distorted, reconfigured, troubled, but I was thinking about this moment in Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, when the boy is called. Remember when her younger brother William is called, and he goes to the mistress first, and his father says, "I called you," right? So asserts a kind of paternal and patriarchal and patrilineal authority, right? In that moment, that even though it's not entirely successful, and even though it can't give Jacobs and her younger brother an entirely kind of unified sense of the self that is organized around and adherent to a kind of a paternal authority figured as father, that nonetheless it gives them something. And I'm wondering if that something that it gives them is the drive toward freedom and the drive toward resistance that we see in both Jacobs and her brother. So I'm just wanting to kind of think about the paternal function as reconfigured, possibly distorted, diminished, but nonetheless retained. And I think that connects with your characterization of the Negro of the Antilles as a kind of fiction, right? Because Fanon can't grant that this function still exists, right? Within, even if nuclear normativity is troubled, even if under these kinds of conditions of just kind of economic exploitation, enslavement, coloniality, that nonetheless you still retain the possibility for a kind of authority that gives, I don't know, I want to say not that fully orders the world, but gives some kind of coherence to its arrangement.
Yeah. You know, in a way, I've thought a lot about that question in different terms. And I have wondered if it means that I am contradicting myself in the position that I take in Mama's baby, Papa's baby. And
I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that.
We need father after all. Okay, so how do you say that, right? Without awarding or rewarding the patriarchal or being critical of it. And so that's some of what this problem is attempting to do. How do you avoid a contradiction? Or if it is a contradiction, how do you heighten it to be taught by it, right? And so what we very often say is that Black culture is matriarchal. It really isn't. Black women heads of household, I don't think makes a configuration or a society matriarchal. I don't think that is the case. And people say very often people say I've been raised perfectly well by a mother, and while that may certainly be true for a lot of people, what can be said about the father that is a beneficent thing to say in relationship to the kind of cultural and social development that we're talking about?
Yes.
And so I've thought about that question a lot over the last few years. That, what do you say? You don't want to say, because I don't think Moynihan was right about much. I still don't think that. So how to put that question? And that's one of the useful things about trying to decide what happens on the other side of middle passage,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, thank you. So I also would, like you, would love a different name for that function, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not as if Black being and Black social, or maybe one way of thinking about Black being and Black social life and thinking of the intramural are as sites of kind of social reordering and sites of kind of social experimentation, where horizontal arrangements might be acceptable, might be kind of rewarding, might give rise to egalitarian arrangements and visionings that are particular to Black life, but that also sustain Black life, right? So that is one way of kind of configuring or thinking about the Black intramural. But I want to say that the movement toward that does not necessarily require the removal of all that inheres in the father function, right? So even if we kind of get away from, just the kind of, will to dominance, the authority of the patronym, the authority of the patriarchal arrangement, only the legitimacy of patrilineage, that even if we kind of move away from those kind of cis heteropatriarchal harms, right, that nonetheless we retain some of the beneficence, some of the benevolence, some of the will to protect, some of the will to guide, and perhaps we loosen gender a little bit as we retain that function. Yeah. I think so, because, as you were talking, I was like, I was thinking, well, I miss my dad. I miss my dad. Like, right, I love my dad. And you can think about that figure as benevolent, even if that, and the functioning of that figure in certain ways that, again, do not necessarily uphold kind of nuclear normativity or will to social dominance, that there must be ways of naming that function, and that those names are maybe particular to Black being and Black social life.
Well, I was trying to think of how to redeem questions about fathers, and what would happen if this sense of authority that I'm talking about were more visible. That is there something that one misses, that natal community in its mythical configuration anyway does not have or does not read or see or understand, because that dimension of experience is not there. That's why I think that the vertical is so important. Yeah, that one has to be able to imagine something beyond one's own ego, right? Beyond one's own powers. And I think that's what respect for authority, which can also be very dangerous, but I think in the way that I'm meaning it, what we're talking about is, well, what's a heaven for, right? That you're trying to grasp something that is greater than oneself, greater than one's siblings, one's contemporaries, one that you're rubbing shoulders with. Oh, I know how to draw an analogy to this. I do not want a president of the United States that I can have a beer with. And of course, I wouldn't have a beer with this one anyway. But that's why I don't want anybody ever talking to me about black inferiority no more. Looking at that guy, don't talk to me about DEI. You gotta be careful. You can become the president of the United States like this. This guy. Wow. So I have no interest at all in rubbing shoulders with the president. I don't want a president who's down to earth. Want a man of the people. And I'm not interested in that. I mean, I want someone that I can respect, right? And I think that's what this thing that I'm calling a vertical breeds, right? And makes ancestry possible, right? I mean, everybody that you are not related to, that you can admire and respect in and out of your family. But if it's just about contemporaneity and presentness, or one who is on the same level, or the same status as myself, it seems to me that one never gets a vision of the grandeur, or what is possible. And so that's what I think fathers and mothers do. That's why I think generational succession is formidable and scary. I think that's why mom and pop are the big story that they are, because they're not on our level. They're elsewhere. They're somewhere else. Yep.
Thank you. So I was just thinking that in some ways when you were talking about having to encounter a limit to one's own kind of desires, wishes, capacities, power to act or to enact in the world, I was just thinking about that in some ways that kind of gets us into a question of how the Black intramural kind of engenders or develops ethics, right? Like ethics within individual Black subjects, and also comes to kind of constitute kind of ethical social, a kind of ethical sociality or ethical social arrangement. So so I just wanted to say that I really appreciated that. And I'm also thinking about how that might also be kind of collectivized, right? So thinking about, for example, in places where maybe it's not your individual dad or mom, but anybody in the community, if they encounter you doing something, you might get into trouble. But also anybody in the community, if they find you lost, might return you, right? So that there's the kind of coming up against a kind of authority, right, that is collectivized, and it, again, the paternal function or the father function, but maybe not embodied in a particular masculinized figure. So that's one thing, but also that in addition to the kind of social and ethical and subjective benefits of that verticality, there's also the promise or maybe the potential of protection. Right, because that's also, I think, a central function. Absolutely.
So thanks for all of these thoughts. Obviously, we didn't coordinate it like this, but just thinking about verticality, paternity, generational succession, mothers, fathers, symbolic authority, and the father function, I brought a little anecdote, not really a question, but I think a whole lot of those themes link to this historical anecdote. So the historical anecdote comes from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. And as soon as I got a sense that you were going to be talking about a transfer of authority from one generation to another, certainly so within a context of anti-blackness, as in this case, in apartheid context, this anecdote came to mind. So it needs a little bit of context. It happens in the mid-1960s, and by the mid-1960s in apartheid South Africa, all the upper echelon of the African National Congress had been arrested. There was the nationalist apartheid government had decimated the black liberation struggle. And it was as if there was this big gap punch right in the hole of the generational succession of that movement. The one exception to that, and what was starting to develop, was the Black consciousness movement. Now, whereas with the African National Congress, it had been, kind of more upwardly middle class, like learned people, whatever. The Black consciousness movement was students, and they tended to be a whole lot younger. And so they also embodied a very different mode of political defiance, and that's what the anecdote's really about. So this is Mandela writing about the first time he encountered a Black consciousness comrade, a youth, while he was on Robben Island. These fellows refused to conform to even basic prison regulations. One day I was conferring with the commanding officer. As we were walking, we came upon this young prisoner. This young man, no more than 18, was wearing his prison cap in the presence of senior officers, a clear violation of regulations. Nor did he stand up when the major entered the room, another violation. The major looked at him and said, "Please take off your cap." The prisoner ignored him. In an irritated tone, the major said, "Take off your cap." The prisoner turned and looked at the major and said, "What for?" I could hardly believe what I just heard. It was a revolutionary question. What for? The major also seemed taken aback, but managed to reply. "It is against regulations," he said. The young prisoner responded, "Why do you have this regulation? What is the purpose of it?" At this point, the situation was too much for the major. He stomped out of the room and he said, "Mandela, you talk to him." But I could not intervene on his behalf, and I simply bowed in the direction of the prisoner to let him know that I was on his side. That was our first exposure to the Black consciousness movement. So I'm tempted to leave it there, but maybe just, there's so many interesting things about it. Maybe partly to do with verticality. But anyways, I'll just be quick. The first time I read it, I thought, whoa, here we go. This is evidence of some kind of Oedipal inheritance or transfer of authority not working. And then I was like, you're such a dumbass. That's obviously a great example of precisely some kind of, well, I don't know if we want to call it Oedipal, but there's clearly something very crucial that happens there, whereby even in this moment, where there seems to be a kind of defiance, you could say that there is an identification with the greater struggle, even though it doesn't want to imitate simply the model of Mandela's leadership in that moment. And I suppose from that, it just seemed to me a bunch of thoughts, which I won't elaborate here, other than to say this, one of the odd moments in that thought was, we could ask about, which is a question for you, what psychoanalytic facets of Oedipus do you want to retain, and what would you prefer to throw out? And what seemed to me interesting about that example, which in a way was or is somehow Oedipal, is that even in the moment when there is some kind of conflict, there is still, I think, a transfer of a certain kind of authority, even though it necessarily gets challenged. But sometimes it may even be the case that the transfer of authority works better when the father as such isn't obviously the present father. Or put differently, there can be some kind of transfer of authority which seems to bypass like a very literal father, which means that the authority needs to, or the fatherness of something, for want of a better word, right, needs to be invented and given a new cultural form. And I think Black consciousness somewhat did that. But the last thought about that is, which is a bit of an experiment, in that moment, for a short period of time, didn't we get the possibility of a strange historical inversion where Biko's Black consciousness becomes the father of Mandela? I'm playing with it, obviously. I don't know if it works. But it's interesting that Mandela says, I simply bowed in the direction of the prisoner to let him know that I was on his side.
And you want to know what to throw out and what not. You want to talk about that? Easy question, yes. You want to say more about that? I like that story. And the whole consciousness movement comes out of, would it be ethical authority, you think?
What authority?
Ethical authority?
I don't know.
Yeah. No.
Before, I didn't know what everyone was going to speak about, but it's just, if you, I suppose, coming from the background I do, it's hard to think of a father figure who has more symbolic resonance than the figure of Mandela. And something about the example is just there's a degree of, Mandela seems a little shocked, but then he kind of gets it, I think, and there's something almost, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much in it, but he seems in that moment to have a realization and maybe even be humble in a sense in front of this new youth movement that he is coming to terms with. And because he's been in prison for some years, has perhaps been separated from. So there's a kind of intergenerational thing happening there, I guess.
Shall we open up to the audience? Should we carry on the mic? Yeah. We have about 15 minutes or so.
Yes, I'm Taiwanese American, and on my American side, our sense of ancestry is quite shallow. But on the Taiwanese side, we have a very strong sense of deep lineages of ancestry going back deep into time. And I'm interested in your earlier work on matriarchies, actually. I know that your focus here was on the paternal function and the Oedipus and framing the Oedipus complex. But my question is around, I'm not sure how this connects to your work, but tell me if you see the liberatory potential of more matriarchal ways of thinking that are still very much in evidence in not only in my homeland, but in indigenous matrilineal cultures, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, especially being a prime example. And I wonder if we can articulate a different notion of the paternal function outside the Oedipal complex when we consider these more matriarchal societies. And I wonder what your thoughts are, how that connects to your own work on matriarchy, and is there a way to articulate that masculine function within the context of matriarchy?
I was thinking about, well, maybe your question connects with what Derek was talking about when he asked, what would you leave out? And I think I would leave out in this transfer of power that we're talking about, the toxic or poisonous masculinity. I think I would leave that out. I think that's what, does it mimic the matriarchal? Does it accompany or complement the matriarchal? I think it can. I mean, it's not homicidal toward the matriarchal. I think I want a patriarchy that has made its peace with its masculinity, with its masculineness, and that it's not always having to prove that it has a pair, right? And I think that's why we are so wretched in our national experience now, because we have a child as president who thinks that there must always be some proof that one is something or other. And I think that's what the problem is. That one is measuring manhood by that. And so what's disgusting and scary about what we're looking at is the extent to which there are people seduced by that idea. And it surprises me, actually, that so many white men have succumbed to what is going on right now. I think of what Rousseau says about men everywhere in chains, right? Enslavement, I think, looks like this. Only one man is free. That man? Are you kidding me? What are we doing? So I think it's the poison that I think we're trying to rub out or extract from the paternal, to go back to what Aaliyah was saying a moment ago about protection or protectiveness. I mean, I think there are ways of doing that don't look homicidal or neurotic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this alive moment that we all got to bear witness to. And I'm asking this question really from a place of some ignorance, maybe. But for instance, Dr. Spillers, when you were just sharing this sentiment about the person that's elected to be the president of the United States at the moment, there feels to be something deeply universal and relatable about that. And these notions about paternal function and patriarchy seem to speak so clearly to so many aspects of all of our shared lives. And also operating in the background of what you all have been talking about is something about race that is particular to Blackness. So it would be helpful to me to learn a little bit more about the way in which Black experience feels like it is sculpting a particular discourse around the paternal function, which in moments in what I heard you all share felt very rooted in a particularly racialized experience, and in other moments felt so profoundly universal about the moment that we all find ourselves in as we're wrestling with these ideas collectively.
I think one thing that blackness cannot be is oblivious to its own humanity. I think it can never mistake its vulnerability, its fragility, the fragility of the mortal moment, that it knows its imperfections, and that death is ever with it, right? It is never trying to deny it. But it seems to me that one of the reasons why we err and why we are in error is that the society thinks that it can escape something, that there's a way out, that it gets a reprieve, that, as my parents used to say, you can go to heaven without dying, right? You just don't go. But I think what blackness accepts is its suffering possibilities, and that it's imperfect, it has deficiencies. But if you don't accept those things, then what you get instead is arrogance and error. You're always asserting your ego or yourself in the world as the master that you're not. And so I think that's what blackness, to my mind, that's the spiritual and intellectual resource of blackness, that it accepts its historical circumstance and that its feet are earthly, right? I mean, it's not somewhere elsewhere. Was it Jeff Bezos who wants earthlings to ship their trash to outer space? What a stupid idea is that? That's an example of what I'm talking about. Who the hell do you think you are? Right? I mean, what are you talking about? It's like, man, never heard such arrogance in all the days of my life. You've messed up your homeland. You've not been a very good steward of this earth. And now you want to fuck up the universe? I mean, nice. Does it ever end? Right? You know, the spectacle of arrogance, which is really childishness. I mean, people who think it's funny that an 82-year-old man was beaten to death nearly with a hammer. That's funny? Or a man who wanted to sell the idea that those Sandy Hook children, and I wept about those children, that they were making it up. So, you know, I look around us at the levels and dimensions of cruelty and meanness in our world, and it's obscene that we are where we are today. And I think that does come out of the inability, among other things, the inability to accept one's human and historical boundness, that the mortal groan is mine, and that there is no way I can avoid that. And so, if you try to avoid it, right, you get dangerous things happening. You get Holocaust, you get genocide, you get all the things that we have nightmares about. And so I think blackness is on the right side of understanding where it is in relationship to those questions. I mean, I don't think there could ever be a black Jeff Bezos. That all the black people who know him would go, man, what? Oh man, come on. Go somewhere and sit down. Or a black Elon Musk. I don't think that would ever be the case. Right.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, I'll try to follow up. Although that was such a fantastic response. I found myself wondering if there's no Oedipal complex, or no, there's no Oedipal transference, no transference neurosis in neurosis in the Antilles. No, for the black. And there's only Oedipal neurosis in for its white America, European context. That we're missing any narrative of Oedipal success, whatever that may mean, in terms of verticality and transfer of generational authority. And it's not only that our current leaders are childlike, but they've cultivated an incestuous paradigm that lacks any the kind of generational tension that we would associate with a paternal law absent the patriarchy, like a paternal law that functioned in a different context. But it seems to me that we can't get where you're trying to go without completely dispensing of all notions of patriarchy, which is not the same as dispensing with notions of the father. But that if we're struggling between incest, the prevalence of incest, because we are lacking something about the authority of the Oedipus, of law, that we're in this conundrum. And the black, it's not only to me, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, because black consciousness would seem not only to signify something about limit and boundedness, but also the proximity to the unbounded. And that's where a Lacanian lens on the feminine beyond the paternal seems to be to think together about this, or Kristeva's thinking. Anyway, so I just started to wonder about incest versus, like, how the co-construction of white Oedipal transference and the lack of an Oedipal of a transference neurosis seem to be co-constructed. A loose set of thoughts that are loosely connected. Your talk, and I want to hear some further thoughts.
Fathers without patriarchy. Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I'd like to. How does it say that part about incest again? Could you?
That it seems to me that we're seeing a prevalence of incestuous dynamics, whether we look at the way the Supreme Court is functioning, the way Trump's coterie is functioning, the way the media functions. There's a collapse of all the dialectics that would sustain the integrity of a space that could properly then lead on to that generational tension that you're talking about.
You know, I often think that one of the curses of slavery is domestic violence. and that you might think of our nation today as an abused family. And what made slavery a curse, of course, was that anywhere slavery is tolerated, everybody is responsible, whether they held slaves or not. So northern communities, for the most part, were not communities that enslaved people, but they tolerated slavery in their neighbors. And so the thing about slavery is that it didn't just hurt those people who were enslaved, it hurt those people who were watching. Those people who tolerated it, lived with it for centuries. And I think a nation cannot do that unless it becomes something of what it's allowed. And so now we're talking about our own children who have no sense of freedom and who cannot look at somebody and say, you stop doing that. That's wrong. Or it is, as you said a moment ago, the law. I mean, we're looking at lawlessness. And so the breakdown in law and the appreciation of the lawful is really quite spectacular. And I think it has a lot to do with our having tolerated slavery as a society for 3 centuries. And so when you speak of incest, it makes me think about abuse, and that the society has to unlearn abuse. It has to be disalienated from abusive conditions and not elect leaders who keep punishing us and whipping us and torturing us. So you're thinking about fathers without the patriarchal would suggest to me that mothers and fathers would protect their children against too many guns, against idiots who run our health care in the United States. You really would love your children. I mean, you wouldn't just mouth it. You would actually love it by not allowing the censorship of books and ideas. But you would really show love for each other, love for spouses, or I call that spice. The plural form. Yeah. That you wouldn't just mouth love of country, you would actually do it by adopting a different practice. And so I think that's what paternity or fatherhood without patriarchy, that's what I mean, without patriarchy might look like, that you might actually have heroes in the world rather than, cardboard cutouts.
So we are right at time. I said that would be the last question, but I don't quite understand. I have one last question for you. It's not the time. So this coming summer will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This past summer was the 70th anniversary of the killing of Emmett Till, who lived one state away from you, from your home state. I mentioned in my introduction that Afro-pessimism is drawn from your work. My question to you is, are you pessimistic about psychoanalysis and about our future? A colleague of mine who teaches here at Boston College, she says that psychoanalysis is always late to the scene. It comes along and explains the scar after the wound has already been issued. So what hope do you have for psychoanalysis and for our country?
It might surprise you, and my friends there in the fourth row, that I'm actually hopeful. I wake up every day hopeful, and the reason why I do is that, well, when you get my age, you know, it's good to wake up. That was good to wake up. Yeah. So you have to wake up with a kind of gladness, right? And so I do, because I keep thinking that we have to learn. That we must learn. That we're going to learn. That somewhere, somehow, we're going to strike gold. I kind of think that, right? I could certainly be wrong, and I think I am enough of an American chauvinist to believe that there is something in the American spirit that is wayward. To go back to your story, Derek, in the sense that I believe that there's a kind of honoriness about Americans, and that at some point somebody is going to wake up and say, enough. Enough. And I think there are people who are doing that all over the country. Maybe not enough for us to be real happy today, but I'm thinking that that is the case. I don't know how true this is. Maybe people who have studied the history of the Second World War may know if this is true or not. But I've heard stories that one of the reasons why Americans were successful warriors in the Second World War is that they were innovative, that if there was a way to do a task, the American wouldn't necessarily do it that way, right? That he would find some other way to do it, an easier way to do it, or do something else. And it's that doing something else that I associate with jazz improvisation, the capacity to be informal, to look at kings of the earth and say, hey, how you doing? That is admirable in its own way, and I keep thinking that the colloquial might play a role here. The informal, the colloquial, the wayward may play a role, and that makes me think I think we'll be okay. Yeah, I think so. We should live that way, right? As if we think that.
Well, perhaps we can hope that after Trump, someone will say, let's end the madness. Okay, I think we do have to finally stop. Before we go, I'd like to thank David, Mookie, and Sophia for bringing us together here tonight. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Department of Africana Studies at UMass Boston, the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics at BC, and the Institute for the Study of Race and Culture at BC's Lynch School of Education. And, of course, a big thank you to our respondents, Derek Hook and Elia Abdur Rahman. And finally, a big round of applause for our keynote. Keynote, the beginning of the